What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with yet another discography ranking for you guys. Yeah, I'm doing this one a week before I planned on releasing it, but I decided since there was no episode of Under the Radar for this week, I figured I'd do something special to make up for it, and I thought, why not do this album ranking a week ahead of time? So, after the Bathory ranking, or around the time of the Bathory ranking, I put up a poll for you guys to vote on, and the theme for the bands was underrated extreme metal bands. And you had quite a few choices, some really good bands, and you guys spoke up, and the band we're going to be talking about tonight is none other than Asphyx. I am very excited, especially to do this one, considering over the past several years, like probably since 2017, Asphyx just has been growing on my list and climbing up my list of favorite bands of all time. Like, I think this band now gets into the top 20, which is insane to think that a band I've only been listening to now for about 5 years climbs up the ranks so much. But hey, Asphyx is a hell of a band, and one of the first real death doom bands that I really got heavily into. And it was because of this I ended up discovering other death doom bands like Hooded Menace, earlier Autopsy, among so many others. So Asphyx are very important to me, I would say. But without further ado, let's get into the history of the band. So Asphyx formed in 1987 out of the Netherlands, and are considered one of the pioneers of what became known as death doom, basically mixing the speed, well, not necessarily the speed, but the rhythms and some of the riffing aspects of death metal, but mixing it with the slow riffs, tempos, and atmosphere of doom metal, and yeah, became one of the first death doom bands to exist. Their original lineup, which lasted from the beginning up until somewhere in 1988, we have Bob Backus on drums, Tony Brookhuis on guitars, and a gentleman by the name of Juiced on bass and vocals. Not much is known about Juiced or Tony, but with Bob, he would be in so many other bands in the following years, like Siege of Power, Grand Supreme Blood Court, Soulburn. And the guy's a busy drummer, so he's been all over the place in the Dutch metal scene. But yeah, this lineup, like I said, lasted from the beginning until somewhere in 1988. Then Juiced would leave the band, and in walks second guitarist Ronnie van der Wey and bassist and vocalist Christian Colley, who was actually the original vocalist of Pestilence, another great band out of, well, once great band out of the Netherlands. Not so much now, but that's a topic for another time. So yeah, four-piece now with two guitar players in the band, and this lineup would last from 1988 until sometime in 1989, and in 1989, Ronnie and Christian would both... Actually, Ronnie, Christian, and Tony would leave the band, leaving Bob on his own to try and find new musicians. In walks guitarist Eric Daniels, and bassist and vocalist and second guitarist Theo Lumens coming in, and this lineup would last from 1989 through mid-1990. After about the summer of 1990, Theo would leave the band, and this is probably the biggest lineup change in the entire history of the band, and this happens before their debut album comes out. Theo leaves, enter in Martin van Drunen, formerly of Pestilence, on bass and vocals. Basically, Martin was looking for a new band after he had left Pestilence after the tour they did with Carcass and Death, especially over in the States. And Martin was having some differences, personal differences with Patrick Mamely especially, and decided to leave Pestilence, and heard that there was an opening for bassist and vocalist in Asphyx, and he decided to take it, and great move on his part. So this lineup would come together and begin the recording process for their debut album in late 1990 and early 1991, and released in 1991, we get the debut album, The Rack. So yeah, The Rack is a very legendary debut, not just for the band, but for all of Death Doom. Pretty much this album, what it did, especially the early Asphyx material, Definitely kind of took what bands like Autopsy were trying to do with slow death metal or death doom, but they really made it much more doomier and even a little bit thrashier. Like, there's always been the debate, is Asphyx death doom or are they just old school death metal? I would say they're a death doom band that just leans more on the death metal end of the genre as opposed to the doom side, because there are many death doom bands that change up the mixture quite a bit. But I digress. The Rack I have is my number 3 album. This is an amazing album from top to bottom. I mean, you start off with that cool little intro and heading into Vermin, which is this nice, like, thrashy D-beat going on. But, yeah, and again, because of that thrash element in their sound, sometimes that can lead credence to them being just a death metal band, but I feel like they had more doom than thrash in their sound, so that's why I would say they are a death doom band. But you do get a lot of great doom moments, especially in tracks like Diabolical Existence, Evocation, the instrumental Ode to a Nameless Grave, Pages in Blood, which might be my favorite song off of this album, and the title track, The Rack, which is 9+ minutes of just pretty much an all-encompassing song of the entire album. Like, you get in that song basically this whole album. Your doom stomps, mid-tempo grooves, thrashy moments, pretty much all mashed together into a nice, neat little box. And Martin Van Druenen's vocals, I mean, he's one of the greatest death metal vocalists of all time because of that torturous, raspy, not the best impression of it. But regardless, fucking fantastic debut. Only reason why it's number 3 is because I think there are 2 albums better than this, and we'll get to those, well, one of those, really soon. But after the release of The Rack, the band went out and toured their asses off all across Europe, including a pretty legendary tour in England, I believe, with Bolt Thrower and Benediction. So, bit of a nice little like PR thing for the band to kind of get them some more fans. Now, in early 1992, they released the Crush the Cenotaph EP, which is actually a hell of an EP, just 3 songs, but they all kick ass. However, they would begin the recording and the writing for the next album. However, it was during this time some tensions were going on between Martin and the rest of the band, as Martin decided to... Well, actually, no, so what happened was Bob and Eric brought in bassist Ron Van Pol to come in, and originally was going to have Ron do the vocals for this album, but Martin had already recorded and the vocals for this album and written most of the lyrics. And so Bob and Eric was like, you know what, these are pretty good, his vocals are very strong on here, his lyrics are good, we'll keep him, but we won't have him do bass. And ultimately, The Rack was actually the last studio album that Martin Van Druenen played bass on. He hasn't played bass on an album, to my knowledge, since. But yeah, Ron would come in on bass, so we have a 4-piece lineup for this next album, and released in the fall of 1992, we get an absolutely legendary album, Last One on Earth. This is my number 1. I knew it would be heading into this video because I'd say I'm going to make the argument that Last One on Earth is the greatest Death Doom album of all time. Up more than Paradise Lost, Lost Paradise, more than like Catatonia's early works, more than Cyanide, My Dying Bride, Winter, Disembowelment. I would argue the greatest Death Doom album, period. Still plays onto that thrash side of their sound quite a bit on here, but the doom, I think, gets even doomier on here. Tracks like MS Bismarck having some great doom moments. The Crusher, which was actually a re-recording from Crush the Cenotaph. I think this version is better than on Crush the Cenotaph, but that's a great doom march with a couple of thrash moments. The title track, the best Asphyx song, in my opinion, of all time. That is 7+ minutes of just haunting, dark, oppressive death doom, with Martin's vocals just going absolutely wild. That lead towards the end, and then after that guitar lead, you get these almost like keyboards or organs or strings, I don't know what is what, maybe even a mellotron, kind of adding more of a haunting atmosphere to the end. Other great tracks on here like Stream of Ancient Wisdom, which was actually a song recorded in their early demos. So that's like an early demo track that they finally put on a proper studio album here. The song Asphyx Forgotten War is fantastic. Top to bottom, this is Death Doom mastery. Can't recommend it enough. If you've never checked out this album before, pause the video, go listen to that album, and then come back to watch the rest. I beg you, you will love it. If you love old school death metal, you're really going to dig it. If you like heavier doom metal, you're going to like it. If you're a fan of both genres together, well then there you go. Now, like I said, Martin was kind of in a bit of a weird place because Bob and Eric, like I said, decided to try and get Ron Van Pol to do the vocals, but Martin had already recorded, but Martin was eventually out of Asphyx by the time Last One on Earth came out. And also around this time in 1992, heading into 1993, Bob Backus would leave the band the first time, leaving pretty much Eric and Ron by themselves to pick up the pieces. So in 1993, Eric and Ron would eventually tackle Sander Van Hoof on drums, bring back Tony Brookhuis back on lead guitar, even getting a keyboardist in Heiko Hank, and Ron Van Pol would eventually take over vocals. And released in 1994, we would get Asphyx, the self-titled album. And I forgot to mention, all these albums on Century Media Records. They've been on Century Media since they've signed, never left the label. So Century Media treats them very, very well, which is cool. Also for this album, they would get a new producer. They would get kind of an unsung hero in the German-Dutch metal scene, and that's Andy Claassen, who was formerly in Holy Moses, and he's done some great production work for a lot of bands, Rotting Christ being one of them. He would come in to do the production on this album, and holy shit, this album is my number 5. I think in terms of what I would say is the most underrated Asphyx album, it's this. Pretty much, this begins a trend, like starting with this album and then the following 3 that came out after, they get forgotten about because of the fact that Martin Van Drunen wasn't in the band at this point. So, yeah, you kind of, these albums are considered lost gems, I would say, especially this one, because I will state, in terms of songwriting, this is up there, I think, with Last One on Earth as maybe the best songwriting album in the entire Asphyx catalog. Like, holy shit. And I think it's the longest album in the discography, too. It's like almost an hour long. So you can definitely tell the band spent a lot of time with the songwriting on this album. The production, maybe my favorite production next to some stuff that'll come out later. But Andy Claassen did a fantastic job with the production on this album. And I mean, top to bottom, these songs, you start off with almost like a funeral doom instrumental with Prelude to the Unhonored Funeral, and then get right into some heavy tracks like Depths of Eternity, Emperor of Salvation, one of the best Asphyx songs of all time, and the longest song they've ever done, which was almost 10 minutes, Initiation into the Ossuary. And I love how it had so many different sections. Like, it starts off almost funeral doom, then it picks up a little bit into traditional death doom, then into some almost bolt thrower mid-tempo moments, and then into some thrash. And it kind of goes all over the place from that moment on. It is a fantastic song. Other great tracks like Back into Eternity, another instrumental, Abomination Echoes, and the closer, a cult classic amongst Asphyx fans, especially the old school, Thoughts of an Atheist, which was an old song they had written way back in the early demo days. The only reason why I guess it never made an album until now was because, well, Martin Van Drunen, when he came into the band, he wasn't so into the whole occult lyrical themes that they were going for early on, and wanted to do his own thing with songs about war and death and torture, and Thoughts of an Atheist just didn't suit him. But we get it on this album, and it's a fantastic closer. I'd say top to bottom, this is a brilliant album. The only reason why it's not ranked higher is because there's a couple albums I like more. And also, while Ron's vocals are strong on this album, it doesn't quite have the same impact as Martin's vocals, or even another vocalist we'll talk about a little bit later. But still, I'd say this is a brilliant album. I'd say for songwriting-wise, this is a good contender against Last One on Earth and a couple others in terms of songwriting chops, because, oh my god, this is maybe the doomiest thing they ever did, and at the same time, maybe the thrashiest thing they ever did. It was like a great balance of all things Asphyx here. Definitely check it out if you haven't listened to it before. Now, eventually, after the self-titled came out, the band actually ended up breaking up for a little while, as pretty much the whole lineup was completely dissolved by this time. However, in 1996, there was now 1996 is an interesting year for Asphyx, because around the same time you saw the beginnings of another Dutch band, Soulburn, which features Bob Backus, Eric Daniels, and another vocalist that we'll talk about a little bit later. Basically, Soulburn is essentially Asphyx mixed with black metal. Like, it's blackened death doom. It's kind of like I said, Asphyx meets like something like Darkthrone, or like those more mid-tempo marches of like old Bathory or something like that. Kind of underrated material. I'd suggest checking out some of those albums. But yeah, that band was starting up around this time. However, in 1996, early 1996, we do get another studio album, as Bob Backus would come back and Theo Lumens would come in to do the bass, guitars, and the vocals. So only a two-piece here. But released in early 1996, we get God Cries. While this one's my number 10, it's my last place album, I'd still think it's a good album. It's just, for me, this didn't really sound too much like an Asphyx album. Like, there really wasn't much in terms of the doom side. Like, this was mostly kind of a straight ahead, straight down the line death metal album, which, nothing wrong with that. I do love death metal, but when it comes to Asphyx, I do like those doom moments showing up in their sound, and there really wasn't much of that on here. And also, the album's very short. Like, it's about half the length of the self-titled. Like, this is only like 31 minutes and some change, but there are some really good songs on here, like Cutthroat Urges, Slaughtered and Sodom, Frozen Soul. Gee, I wonder how the band Frozen Soul got their name. Maybe I'm talking out of my ass. But still, yeah, and also Theo's vocals, I feel like he was trying too hard to sound like Martin Van Drunen instead of sounding like how he did on another album we're going to talk about in just a moment. But still, not terrible. The production on this, it was a very heavy album. Like, they were tuning lower at this point. So yeah, it's a good album. However, I think it's not really an Asphyx album per se. I think this sounds more like, say, like a band like Benediction or Gorefest or something like that. It doesn't really sound like an Asphyx album because there's really not that many moments of doom. Like, it's just straight ahead death metal. I'm not hating on it. I actually think it's a good album. It's short, sweet, to the point. But calling it Asphyx, I feel like, was kind of a kiss of death. At least that's just my opinion. Now, going back to what I was talking about with how 96 was a bit of a strange year, the band actually broke up again after the release of God Cries. However, in late 96, Century Media wanted to have another Asphyx album, so that way the brand can still be put out there. However, it was around this time Soulburn really started to take off, and so Bob Backus, Eric Daniels decided, well, we do have this demo recording of what would have been our debut album with us two, as well as Theo Lumens in the band. And this demo album was recorded back in 1990, like early 1990, I should say. So they decided to go with this demo album and released in the fall of 1996. Wow, I need a drink. So released in the fall of 1996, we would get Embrace the Death. This is my number 8 album. I actually think for a demo recording, this is one of my favorites to listen to. Now, granted, essentially like 90% of this album are original lyrics of songs that would eventually be on the rack. Like, take, for example, the title track on this album, Embrace to Death, was eventually rewritten on the rack as Pages and Blood. Circle of the Secluded on Embrace to Death would eventually become Evocation. But still, like, top to bottom, I really enjoy this album. Yeah, the production's rough, but it's a demo. I'm gonna give it a break because it's a demo, and even for a demo recording, it sounds pretty solid for what it was. Theo's vocals on here, I think, were much better than it was on God Cries, because he didn't sound like he was trying to pretend to be Martin Van Buren. He actually had his own sound. He kind of sounded like a slightly deeper Chuck Schuldiner a little bit on this album. Like, kind of like take Chuck's vocals from, say, Spiritual Healing and Scream Bloody Gore, but make him just maybe a slight step lower, just a little bit. But despite, like I said, 90% of this album was essentially re-recorded and rewritten for the rack, but still, these versions are pretty cool to listen to in comparison. Also, you get Crush the Cenotaph on here, the original version of Thoughts of an Atheist, original version of Streams of Ancient Wisdom, and even 2 tracks that were not re-recorded on future releases, and they were Vault of Veiling Souls and Eternity's Depth. But I enjoy this album for what it is. I do come back to this one quite a bit because I enjoy it. Yeah, it's ranked near the bottom just because I just like so many of their other albums more, but definitely check this one out, especially if you're a fan of listening to like obscure stuff and raw lo-fi stuff. This is definitely up your alley. I will definitely guarantee that. But like I said, the band took a break after God Cries came out because Soulburn was going on. However, the same time as Soulburn going on, Asphyx relaunched in 1997, though it was kind of meshed together with Soulburn, as Bob and Eric would eventually tackle Wayne's Gubbles on bass and vocals in both bands, and Wayne's would also be in the band Pentacle. So, busy guy. Very, very busy guy. So this lineup was together for Soulburn, but there was still... It's very confusing, like, was this Asphyx? Was this Soulburn? Especially if you go to the Metal Archives, the timelines get a little confusing. However, in 2000, the band Asphyx would come back with this lineup and record their next album, and released in 2000, we get On the Wings of Inferno. This is my number 9 album. I think this was a big step up from God Cries, in my opinion. Like I said, God Cries, good album, but just didn't quite sound like an Asphyx album. Here, this album kind of felt like an amalgamation of the early stuff and God Cries. Like, there's definitely a little bit more akin to the death metal side, but the doom returns, like in, let me see some examples, like Summoning the Storm, the title track, Marching Towards the Styx, Chaos in the Flesh has some cool doom parts, and this one's actually surprisingly shorter than God Cries, like I think by a few minutes. So this is like not even 30 minutes, but still, every song's packed with a punch, they're well written, and I think Wayne's vocals, I think he sounds closer to like John Tardy than Martin Van Buren. So this almost feels like what would happen if John Tardy from Obituary sang for an Asphyx album, and I think that's what you get here, and I actually really like this album. Yeah, it's second to last only because I just like the other albums more, but definitely check this out. This is some really good stuff. Short, sweet, and to the point, and it'll punch you right in the penis. Anyways, moving on. So, unfortunately, the band broke up yet again after the release of On the Wings of Inferno, and actually the band would lay dormant for a long time. However, the band would get back together in 2007 with a revamped lineup. Bob Backus returns on drums, Wayne's Gubbles back, this time only on bass, Returning on vocals, Martin Van Drunen is back, and he's been in the band ever since. And then for guitarists, they would pick up Hail of Bullets and Thanatos guitarist Paul Bayans to come in to play guitar. So this would be the lineup going forward for the next few years. They got together in 2007 initially to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the band's existence, playing festival shows and tours all across Europe. However, because of the success of those tours and those shows, the band thought, you know what? People remember us, and you know what? Why don't we keep this train rolling studio album-wise? So they would eventually begin writing their next album in 2008 and entered the studio. And for the production on this album, I think the band produced it themselves, but it would be mixed and mastered by the legend himself, Dan Swano. If you know me, you know how much I love Dan Swano, so I'm not going to gush right here. But he would actually be mixing and mastering pretty much all of the rest of the albums except for the last one, which we'll get to later. But they would begin the recording in 2008, and finally released in 2009, we get Death the Brutal Way. This is my number 4 album. Welcome back. Welcome back, Asphyx, after 9 years since On the Wings of Inferno. And talk about a massive step up. Like, whew. Production is amazing. Dan Swano did a great job. Everything is layered perfectly well. Maybe a tad bit compressed in terms of the volume, like it's a little bit loud, but not as loud as the follow-up, which we'll get to later. But top to bottom, some brilliant songs, and definitely this is where you start to get a little bit more of the mid-tempo coming in, like kind of like that bolt thrower groove, especially in the opening tracks like Scorbutics and the Herald. Those have some cool bolt thrower stomps to it. And then you get the title track, which has this great like thrashy gallop in the beginning. Then it gets really doomy in the breakdown, and then into that mid-tempo before you finish it off with full-on thrash. Asphyx 2, They Died As They Marched. Great sequel to Asphyx Forgotten War, and this time they got even more doomy. Like, this was one of the doomiest things of the entire album. And then you get in the second half where things get really doomy. Songs like Black Hole Storm, Rifle Gun Redeemer, and K-Porn. The Saw, The Torture, The Pain. Like, those final 4 songs really bring out more doom, just like the Asphyx 2. But man, and also some more melancholic melodies come in, especially in the beginning of Black Hole Storm, like that piano intro. So somber and dark. And they play that riff on the guitars at the end, and it's just magical. It is so magical. Top to bottom, this is one of my favorite comeback albums ever, because, you know, 9 years since their last album, and they come back, and they've been on a tear really ever since. And this album certainly showed that A, Asphyx can still kick ass, and B, with a new lineup, they can still deliver some badass stuff. Yeah, definitely check it out if you haven't already. So, not long after Death the Brutal Way came out, the band would embark on a tour. However, in 2010, Wayne Gubbles would end up leaving the band to focus primarily on Pinnacle, since that was pretty much his baby. So coming in on bass would be Alwyn Zur, who is still in the band to this day. He would come in on bass, and the band would begin the writing process for their next album in 2011, then entered the studio once again with Dan Swano mixing and mastering, and released in 2012, we would get Deathhammer. This is my number 2 album. I fucking love this album to death. This was one of the first Asphyx albums I got into and that I got in the collection, and holy shit, this album slays fucking nutsacks. And I like the balancing act of this album. Like, this album's like 40% doom, 30% thrash, 30% bolt thrower grooves, which is really cool. And also, I kind of compared this album a little bit to Celtic Frost monotheist in terms of that more darker side of Asphyx sound, and also the real doomy tracks like Minefield or Lancer, We Doom You to Death, one of my favorite songs, and also one of my favorite songs to play on bass and drums, and occasionally guitar. It's a phenomenal song. It's an easy song to learn, but it's catchy as hell. And as the Magma Mammoth rises, that closer with those amazing, like, marching, stomping grooves, fucking killer stuff. And then even the thrashy tracks, like the title track, which is only a little over 2 minutes, but holy shit, it is an awesome song. So yeah, really the only complaint with this album is, well, I talked about with Death the Brutal Way how it might have been a little bit compressed. This album is compressed as nuts. Like, it is loud, but everything's mixed well, so it's not like the instruments were like there wasn't one instrument weighing in on top of the other too much. It's just that the volume in the mix, in the masters, just was really high up. But regardless, I highly recommend you check out this album. This is some badass stuff, and my personal favorite of their comeback run. And this is the closest album to me that can rival Last One on Earth in the ranking. I just absolutely love this album. Check it out if you haven't. I know I keep saying that, but I highly recommend you check out this whole discography. Now, the band would tour for a couple of years on this album, and then in 2014, Bob Backus would leave the band for the second time, and mainly to focus on Grand Supreme Blood Chord, which Martin Van Drunen and Eric Daniels are both in that band, so it's not like there was any animosity with Bob and the rest of the Asphyx guys. He's still very good friends with them. He just wanted to focus on some other stuff, plus he's also in the band Siege of Power, as well as with Paul Bayans. I think Paul Bayans is in Siege of Power. Correct me if I'm wrong. But to replace Bob Backus, we would get German drummer Stefan Husky Huskins, who joined in 2014, and also later on would join Sodom for a little bit. And while I like Bob Backus's drum work, his style of fills is maybe a little too simplistic, whereas Stefan's going faster in the thrash moments and doing much more crazy drum fills. So I kind of look at this as a bit of an upgrade, in my opinion. So this lineup of Martin, Paul, Alwyn, and Stefan started in 2014, and it remains the lineup to this day. And the band would begin the writing and recording process in 2015 for their next album, once again mixed and mastered by Dan Swano, and released in 2016, we would get Incoming Death. This is my number 7 album. I really like this album, though it definitely fell in comparison to other albums. But it's still a phenomenal album, in my opinion. Like, kind of doing a bit of that similar mixture of Deathhammer with the Doom moments, the thrash stuff, and the bolt thrower type grooves. However, I think this album has a little bit more Doom going for it than Deathhammer, although tracks like the title track, which is under 2 minutes, and it's probably the thrashiest song they have ever done. It is fucking fast, brutal, holy shit. But then the two standouts, well, also I forgot, Division Brandenburg is a really cool kind of like bolt thrower stomp of a song. But the two standouts were the two long and doomy tracks, The Grand Denial and Death the Only Immortal. Like, both have very beautiful moments. Like Grand Denial, you get this like beautiful clean guitar for the final minute that just adds a depressing atmosphere on top. And then the lead in Death the Only Immortal at the end is just atmospheric, intense, somber. I could go on and on with that song. That is one of the best songs that the band has ever written. Like, holy shit. But yeah, this album, top to bottom, another great one. Now, the band would tour pretty heavily for the next few years off of Incoming Death, and eventually began the writing for this album in late 2019, and then they would begin the recording in early 2020. However, the recording took a little bit longer due to COVID. Fuck COVID, by the way. But they would spend time together in the studio to get this album out, and eventually released in January of 2021, we would get the last Asphyx album released to date, Necroceros, or Necroceros. I hear it both ways. I think Necroceros sounds more badass, but regardless, this is my number 6 album. I love this album. This was one of my favorites of last year, so it definitely goes to show you how brutally consistent this band is. It's honestly like between 4 and 7, I can arrange them in any order and it wouldn't be wrong, because there will be moments where, hey, I'll like the self-titled more, other times I'll like Necroceros more. But, like, it doesn't beat the top 3 for me, but 4 through 7, I can arrange them in any order and it wouldn't be wrong. But Necroceros, fucking fantastic album. I mean, tracks like Knights Templar Stand was really cool. And then, probably my 2 favorites off of this album, Botox Implosion, which was probably the thrashiest track of the album, and also, there was a bit of a transition in the guitar sound on this album. Like, Botox Implosion, like, pretty much whenever you listen to a lot of Asphyx songs, you'll hear that most of their songs are recorded in D tuning. Some songs they get into B. This album was like 97% B tuning, with Botox Implosion being the one song in D tuning, which definitely gave it that old school Asphyx feel. But the rest of the album was in B, and it made for a heavy experience. But then the other standout, 3 Years of Famine, which was actually maybe my favorite song of 2021 as a whole. Just brilliant. One of the top 5 best songs of Asphyx's whole career. I mean, and that song, it dooms, it's beautiful, very melodic, and kind of hints nods to old school metal. Like, the opening riff reminds me of Skull Crusher by Overkill. The clean guitar break in the middle reminds me of To Live Is To Die by Metallica. If you want to know my full details about it, check out the review I did for this album over a year and a half ago. But yeah, number 6, it's brilliant. Fucking love it. And that does it for my ranking of Asphyx albums. This was challenging because this band is one of the most consistent bands in terms of the quality of their studio albums in all of metal. Like, despite God Cries being last, it's still good. It's just, like I said, what I said. But yeah, the kings of Death Doom, the true pioneers of Death Doom. Without this band, who the fuck knows where Death Doom would be today? I'll just go ahead and say it. All hail Martin Van Drunen. All hail Asphyx. Nothing more, nothing less. But anyways, what did you guys think of this ranking? What is your favorite Asphyx album? Let me know in the comments below. How would you rank this discography? And then also, finally, there's been a poll up for a little while to determine who's going to be the next band I'm going to rank, and this ranking will be in early August. And it looks like the band is going to be Mastodon, so I'm going to be ranking Mastodon next, and I can't wait to do that because they're one of my all-time favorites as well. But anyways, thank you guys for watching this ranking for Asphyx. Horns high. See you guys soon.
At the ballpark. Someone's gonna put lasagna.
I took a tomato.
Okay, yeah, it's Levi. It's Levi.
Damn it.
I'm done. Could I
I really want to know what he got for this one.
Alright, Seth, let's go to Tomato Town.
That is dying.
I would like a single slice of your greatest tomatoes
I
in
would
the
like
park.
your finest tomato, please.
Calm down, Seth. Calm down, Seth. Calm down.
Somebody vote.
No, it's
Levi.
Clive is the
Levi's the one that has some
Clive is
votes.
the majority.
Yeah.
Oh
my
my.
lord.
That's breed.
Tomato. I would be really interested to see these prompts.
Yeah, like
Officer,
literally.
please escort me out of the ballpark. I just wanted to eat my tomato.